In the cold hospital room, the doctors whispered the wrong diagnoses, until a housekeeper shouted, "Don't touch him." No one knew that the invisible young woman had once been a doctor, and when the most powerful man in the room was on the verge of death, only she could save him. But what happened next, no one was prepared to see. The sound of medical monitors filled the emergency room of St. Jude's Hospital with the chill of a death sentence. There were expensive flowers in the hallway, but not a single loved one waiting for news. On the gurney, the young businessman struggled to breathe, his eyes closed, his face as pale as the white paint on Austin's historic Victorian homes. From the other side of the glass door, the doctors whispered among themselves with the arrogance of those who think they know everything, but she knew they had no idea what they were doing. "Don't touch him," shouted Sarah, the young woman in a simple uniform, her eyes blazing with a fire that refused to be invisible any longer. One of the doctors turned, confused. Another frowned. A housekeeper giving medical advice? A third scoffed, adjusting his glasses with disdain. But in that instant, Sarah Miller was once again who she used to be, the doctor who had hung up her stethoscope to escape her own pain. Her name was Sarah Miller, just turned 25, born in a dusty town in West Texas where women learn to heal before they learn to read. Raised by a midwife grandmother who taught her to listen to bodies before diagnoses, she had come to Austin on a full academic scholarship with the dream of saving lives. She graduated from the University of Texas at Austin's medical school at 23, with honors and the promise of a brilliant future. But it all came crashing down like a house of cards the night she lost her younger sister, Hope, during an emergency surgery, where the attending physicians refused to listen to a second-year resident. Since that cursed morning, she swore she would never wear a white coat again. She packed her diplomas in a cardboard box and walked out of the hospital with a shattered heart and lost faith. She ended up working as a housekeeper in the mansion of the Morgan family, one of the wealthiest in Austin, caring for their rebellious heir, a young millionaire named Alexander. Alexander Morgan, 32, was the owner of a fortune built in silence after the sudden death of his parents in a car accident 5 years earlier. Brilliant in business, clumsy in human relationships, he hid his deep sadness behind multi-million-dollar contracts, trips around the world, and parties that lasted until dawn. He had a distant beauty, like the marble statues that adorned the central courtyard of his historic home, and fragile health that he himself preferred to ignore. His blue eyes, inherited from an Italian great-grandmother, contrasted with his olive skin, and his smile rarely appeared without being forced. When Alexander collapsed in his home's garden that October afternoon, while reviewing his company's financial statements under the shade of a large oak tree, he insisted that Sarah accompany him to the hospital. "You're the only person I trust," he murmured with a strained voice, not knowing that she carried much more than family secrets. She also carried the guilt of a past she hadn't managed to overcome, and the weight of an unrequited love that had grown in silence during 2 years of living together. At St. Jude's Hospital, Sarah became invisible again. Officially, she was just the companion, the faithful employee waiting in the hallway, with her hands clasped and worry etched on her face. But she saw beyond what the doctors wanted to acknowledge. She saw the signs in Alexander's swollen fingers, in the irregular rhythm of his breathing, in that tired look that had appeared in recent weeks. The doctors were treating him for a pulmonary embolism, but Sarah knew with that intuition she had inherited from her grandmother and perfected during late-night shifts in internal medicine that they were completely wrong. There was joint stiffness, slight tremors in his hands, an almost imperceptible rash on his cheeks that intensified with the sun, symptoms she had learned to identify during a rotation in the rheumatology department at Austin General Hospital years ago. It was systemic lupus erythematosus, a treacherous autoimmune disease that could deceive the most arrogant doctors, and they were about to give him anticoagulants that could kill him in a matter of hours. The first alarm bell rang when she found in the private room's trash can a prescription with the wrong name. A typo? No. It was the treatment protocol for another patient, an elderly man with heart problems, carelessly attached to Alexander's file. The second was when she heard the nurse on duty comment that Dr. Harrison, the physician in charge, was in a hurry to free up the VIP suite because there was a waiting list of higher-paying patients. The third sign was intimate and devastating. Looking at the unconscious Alexander, his black hair tousled on the white pillow and his pale skin under the cold hospital light, she realized it was no longer just professional duty or loyalty that kept her there. It was true, pure and desperate love. For the first 72 hours, Alexander wavered between moments of confused lucidity and episodes of delirium that terrified Sarah. She began to act in the shadows, checking the IV bags when the nurses weren't present, discreetly consulting medical textbooks from the hospital library in the early morning hours, and keeping a hidden notebook where she jotted down every change in his condition, every new symptom, every reaction to the medication. She faced two enormous obstacles: the widespread distrust of a woman with no apparent credentials and the increasingly suspicious surveillance of Dr. Harrison, who had started asking uncomfortable questions about her medical knowledge. The situation reached a crisis point on a rainy November night when Alexander had a severe reaction after being administered a high dose of heparin. His blood pressure plummeted, he started bleeding from his nose, and he lost consciousness completely. The medical team announced they would put him in a medically induced coma to stabilize him, a measure Sarah knew would be fatal given his true diagnosis. Desperate and with trembling hands, she did something she hadn't done in 2 years. She called the only person who still trusted her as a doctor. Dr. Eleanor Vance, 68, had been her mentor during her residency and the only one who had believed in her diagnostic instincts from the beginning. After retiring from Austin General, she had moved to a small town in the Texas Hill Country, where she now tended a garden of medicinal plants and raised chickens. When she received Sarah's call at 3 in the morning, she didn't hesitate for a second. "I'll be there in 4 hours," she said simply, and hung up the phone. Dr. Vance arrived at the hospital disguised as Alexander's distant aunt, with fake documents she had obtained from a contact in the city, and an attitude so authoritative that no one dared to question her. After discreetly examining Alexander and reviewing all his charts, she confirmed what Sarah had suspected from day one: acute systemic lupus erythematosus, complicated by probable lupus nephritis that was affecting his kidneys. When Sarah confronted Dr. Harrison with the real findings, presenting solid medical evidence and demanding they change the treatment immediately, he accused her of practicing medicine without a license, threatened to call the police, and ordered her thrown out of the hospital. The security guards were already walking down the hall when something unexpected happened. Alexander opened his eyes. Weak, confused but conscious, the first thing he asked was, "Where's Sarah?" When they explained that she had been removed for interfering with medical treatment, his reaction was immediate and fierce. Despite his condition, he demanded to speak with the hospital director, threatened to withdraw all the donations his family had made over the decades, and put his lawyers to work on a medical malpractice lawsuit that would shake the institution to its foundations. "If she leaves, I leave too," he declared in a hoarse but firm voice, "and I'm taking all the media attention this scandal is going to generate with me." But the most intense and painful revelation came that same night when Alexander, now under the correct treatment supervised by Dr. Vance, took Sarah's hand and said, "I know who you really are. I know you're a doctor. I've known since the first day you came to my house, but I never pushed you because I could see you had run away from something very painful. Now I understand you ran from the very place that is saving my life." Sarah felt as if an invisible armor she had carried for 2 years had been stripped away. Tears streamed down her cheeks as he continued to speak. "I've loved you since I saw you crying in the garden the first week you worked at my house. You were crying by the white roses, and I thought you were the most beautiful and mysterious woman I had ever seen. But I also respected your silence, because I understood that we all have scars that need time to heal." The mutual confession happened in the early morning, between the sound of machines that now monitored a real recovery and the scent of fresh flowers she had brought from the house's garden. Sarah told him about hope, about the guilt that had haunted her, about the nightmares where she saw her younger sister calling to her from a hospital gurney. Alexander told her about the profound loneliness he had felt after losing his parents, how business had become his only way to escape the void, and how her presence had been the first thing to calm the constant sadness he carried in his chest. "But now I'm scared," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Scared of being a doctor again, scared that my past will ruin what we could have, scared of not being enough for someone like you." He took her face in his hands, still weak but firm. "Sarah, you saved my life not just as a doctor, but as a woman. You taught me that courage isn't about not being afraid, but about acting in spite of fear. And I want to spend the rest of my life helping you remember how extraordinary you are." The first kiss came with the first light of dawn, soft and full of promise, as the bells of St. Mary's Cathedral rang in the distance, as if the city itself was celebrating that 2 wounded souls had found their way back to love. Have you ever had to hide who you really are for fear of rejection? Have you felt that your past defines you more than your dreams? Share with us what city you're writing from, and don't forget to like this story If you believe everyone deserves a second chance at love, your support motivates us to keep telling stories that touch the heart. Chapter 2. The next 2 weeks at St. Jude's Hospital became a silent battlefield where Sarah fought not only against Alexander's illness, but also against her own inner demons. The correct treatment had begun to show results. The blood tests gradually improved, the inflammation in his joints decreased, and color had slowly returned to his face. But every small medical victory intensified the emotional war raging in Sarah's heart. Dr. Vance had stayed in Austin longer than planned, settling into a hotel near the hospital and personally supervising Alexander's recovery. One afternoon, as they reviewed the latest lab results together in the small waiting area of the private suite, the older woman took Sarah's hands and spoke with the frankness that only a friendship forged in the trenches of medicine allows. "My dear, I've seen many cases of doctors who leave the profession after a personal tragedy," she began, her voice soft but firm. "Some never return, and that's fine. But others, like you, have a gift that transcends personal pain. Your sister Hope didn't die because of you. She died because sometimes medicine has limits that are painful to accept." Sarah felt tears forming again, but this time she didn't hold them back. "Doctor, I knew something was wrong. I saw the signs. I insisted they examine her more thoroughly, but no one listened to me because I was just a second-year resident. They operated on her for appendicitis when she actually had a perforated bowel they had missed. She died of sepsis 3 days later, and I couldn't do anything." "And what do you think you would have done differently if you had been the chief surgeon that night?" Dr. Vance asked gently. "Do you think you could have changed the initial diagnosis without the proper tests? Do you think one more experienced person could have altered the outcome?" The questions fell like stones into a calm lake, creating ripples of reflection that Sarah hadn't allowed herself during 2 years of self-imposed guilt. For the first time since Hope's death, she began to consider that perhaps her sister had died from a tragic combination of circumstances, not from her personal failure as a doctor. "But now with Alexander it was different," her mentor continued. "This time you had the experience, the knowledge, and the determination to make a difference. You saved a life because you refused to stay silent again. Don't you think that's exactly the lesson Hope would have wanted you to learn?" Meanwhile, Alexander was experiencing his own internal revolution. The days of illness had given him time to reflect on the last 5 years of his life, and he didn't like what he saw. He had built an impressive business empire, but he had lived like a ghost in his own existence. The parties, the trips, the expensive acquisitions had been just elaborate ways of avoiding the loss of his parents and the emotional void it had left. One night, when Sarah had fallen asleep in the armchair next to his bed, he watched her for hours. Her light brown hair fell like a cascade over the back of the chair, and even in her sleep, her face retained that expression of tender concern he had grown to love. Her green eyes, which during the day shone with intelligence and determination, now rested under delicate eyelids that trembled slightly with her dreams. "What are you dreaming about, Sarah?" he murmured so quietly that he barely heard himself. But as if she had felt his gaze, she woke with a start, instinctively bringing a hand to her neck in a protective gesture he had noticed many times. "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" she asked immediately, standing up and approaching the bed with the professional efficiency she had perfected over years of medical practice. "I just need you," he replied with an honesty that surprised them both. "Sarah, all these days, I've been thinking, what are we going to do when I get out of here? Are you going to go back to being my housekeeper? Are you going to pretend you're not the smartest, bravest woman I've ever met?" She sat on the edge of the bed, avoiding his gaze. "Alexander, your world and mine are completely different. You have companies to run, social commitments, a reputation to maintain. I'm a woman with no active license, a complicated past, and—" "Stop," he interrupted, taking her hand with more strength than he'd had in days. "Since when is love governed by university degrees or bank accounts? My world is worthless without you in it. These days have taught me that I'd rather be poor with you than rich without you." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Harrison, who was accompanied by the hospital director, and 2 people Sarah didn't recognize. The atmosphere tensed immediately. "Mr. Morgan?" the director began with a nervous smile. "I'm pleased to inform you that we have reviewed your entire case, and there were indeed some misunderstandings in the initial diagnosis. We want to assure you that we will take all necessary measures to prevent this from happening again." Alexander sat up in bed, and Sarah could see his expression transform from the tenderness he had shown moments before to the corporate coldness he reserved for difficult negotiations. "Misunderstandings?" he repeated in a dangerously calm voice. Is that what you call nearly killing a patient through medical negligence and professional arrogance? Mr. Morgan, please understand that, Dr. Harrison began, but Alexander silenced him with a gesture. No, doctor, you're the one who needs to understand. This woman, he said, pointing to Sarah, saved my life. Not only that, but she did it while you all treated her like she was invisible, humiliated her, and finally threw her out of the hospital for telling the truth. One of the unknown people stepped forward. Mr. Morgan, I'm Mr. Ramirez, the hospital's attorney. We've come to offer you generous compensation for the inconvenience caused, and we also want to make a proposal to Miss Miller. Sarah felt her heart race. What kind of proposal? We've investigated your academic record, the lawyer continued. We know you graduated with honors from the University of Texas and were considered one of the most promising residents before your departure. The hospital is prepared to offer you a full scholarship to complete a specialization in rheumatology, with a guaranteed position as an attending physician once you finish. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt as if the floor was moving beneath her feet. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, the chance to return to medicine with honor, to specialize in the field where she had shown exceptional instinct. But there is one condition, the director added, and Sarah knew immediately that this was the catch. We would need you to sign a non-disclosure agreement about the recent events, to protect the hospital's reputation and avoid unnecessary negative publicity. Alexander sat up as straight as his condition allowed. In other words, you want to buy her silence. We want to offer a mutually beneficial solution for all parties involved, the lawyer corrected diplomatically. Sarah looked at Alexander, then at the hospital authorities, and finally at Dr. Vance, who had remained silent, observing the entire scene from the corner of the room. Her mentor gave her a look she knew well. It was the same expression she wore when a critical medical decision depended entirely on the judgment of the doctor in charge. I need time to think about it, Sarah finally said, her voice firmer than she felt. Of course, the director replied. Take all the time you need, but we would ask for an answer by Friday. When the hospital representatives left, the room was plunged into a heavy silence. Alexander was the first to speak. You're going to accept, he said, and it sounded less like a question and more like a painful statement. I don't know, she admitted. It's an incredible opportunity, Alexander. I could be a doctor again. I could specialize. You could forget I exist, he finished bitterly. That's not fair, Sarah exclaimed, feeling frustration begin to take over. Why does it have to be a choice between my career and you? Why can't you support what's best for me? Because I'm scared, he shouted, surprising them both with the intensity of his emotion. I'm scared that when you're Dr. Sarah Miller, rheumatology specialist, you'll realize that Alexander Morgan is just a boring businessman you fell for when you were vulnerable and confused. The brutal honesty of his confession cut the air like a knife. Sarah went to him and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look into her eyes. Alexander Morgan, she said, her voice trembling but determined. I fell in love with you long before you got sick. I fell in love with the man who planted flowers in the garden when he thought no one was watching. I fell in love with the one who kept pictures of his parents on every desk in the house, but never talked about them because it hurt too much. I fell in love with the one who donated millions to children's hospitals, but didn't want anyone to know. I fell in love with the man who treated me with respect and kindness when the rest of the world saw me as just another piece of furniture. Tears were now streaming freely down both their cheeks. But I also need you to understand, she continued, that returning to medicine isn't just a career for me. It's how I honor my sister's memory, how I make sense of all the pain I've carried. If you really love me, you have to love all of me, including my need to heal others. He closed his eyes and nodded slowly. You're right. Forgive me. I'm being selfish because I'm terrified of losing you. You're not going to lose me, she whispered, kissing his forehead gently. But I'm not signing that non-disclosure agreement either. If I'm going back to medicine, it's going to be on my own terms, with the truth as my only foundation. Dr. Vance, who had been watching the exchange with moist eyes, finally spoke from her corner. There's another option you may not have considered, she said, walking toward them. What would you say if I proposed that we could create our own opportunity without compromising the integrity of either of you? They both looked at her with curiosity and hope. Alexander, you have the resources. Sarah, you have the knowledge and the passion. I have the experience and the contacts. Why don't we found our own clinic, an institution where medicine is practiced with humanity and where no patient is treated as invisible? The idea landed between them like a seed in fertile soil. Over the next few hours, the three of them sketched out the first plans for what would become a community clinic, specializing in autoimmune diseases, located on a piece of land Alexander could buy on the outskirts of Austin, where the air was cleaner and patients could recover surrounded by gardens and tranquility. "We'll call it the Hope Clinic," Sarah proposed, her voice thick with emotion, "in honor of my sister and everything this experience has taught us about not losing faith." When the first rays of sun entered the hospital room window, the three were bent over napkins and loose papers, drawing rough blueprints and making lists of specialists who could join the project. For the first time in years, Sarah felt completely at peace with herself. She didn't have to choose between love and medicine because she had found a way to have both. Friday arrived, and with it, the meeting with the hospital representatives. Sarah walked into the meeting wearing the same simple suit she had worn the day they threw her out, but with a completely different posture. She was no longer the scared housekeeper begging to be heard. She was Dr. Sarah Miller, co-founder of a new medical institution that would change the way medicine was practiced in Austin. "Gentlemen," she began with a serene smile, "I deeply appreciate your offer, but I must decline. I've decided that my future lies in building something new, something where medical truth and human dignity are the only requirements to practice medicine." The shock on the directors' faces was evident, but Sarah continued, "However, I want you to know that I will not remain silent about what happened here. I will tell this story at medical conferences, in specialized publications, and in any forum where it can help prevent other patients from going through what Mr. Morgan went through." When she left that meeting, Alexander was waiting for her in the hospital lobby, already discharged and dressed in street clothes for the first time in weeks. He hugged her with a strength that spoke of gratitude, love, and a promise of a shared future. "Are you ready to change the world with me, Dr. Miller?" he whispered in her ear. "I'm ready to change our world, Mr. Morgan," she replied, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted of new beginnings and dreams to be fulfilled. But neither of them imagined the surprises that fate still had in store for them, nor the obstacles they would have to overcome before their love story could have the happy ending they both deserved. Chapter 3. 6 months after leaving St. Jude's Hospital, Sarah and Alexander stood in the middle of a dusty plot of land on the outskirts of Austin, watching as the first structures of the Hope Clinic began to take shape. The afternoon sun painted the steel beams that would soon support the main building's roof in gold, and the scent of damp earth after the morning rain filled the air with promises of growth and renewal. "Do you regret it?" Alexander asked, taking Sarah's hand as they watched workers install the windows of what would be the outpatient area. "Which part?" she replied with a playful smile. "Falling in love with you, rejecting the hospital's offer, or spending all your savings on this project?" "All three," he joked, pulling her to his chest, "especially the savings part." The truth was, they had both invested much more than money in the clinic. Sarah had spent months studying for the board exams that would allow her to practice as a doctor again, while simultaneously working with architects and designers to create a space that was both functional and healing. Alexander had completely reorganized his business empire, selling some properties and restructuring others to generate the capital needed for construction and the first few years of operation. Dr. Vance had been their guardian angel throughout the process. Not only had she used her contacts to attract other specialists to the project, but she had also stayed in Austin to personally oversee every medical aspect of the planning. At 68, she had found a new passion in this project that combined cutting-edge medicine with human warmth. "The first medical equipment arrives tomorrow," Dr. Vance announced, approaching them with a folder full of documents and an expression of satisfaction Sarah hadn't seen since her residency days. "The MRI machine, the lab equipment, and the hospital beds. In 2 weeks, we'll be ready for our first patients." But the road to this moment had not been easy. The first few months after leaving the hospital had been filled with bureaucratic hurdles, funding problems, and direct attacks from Austin's established medical community. The American Medical Association had publicly questioned Sarah's credentials, insinuating that a woman who had abandoned medicine for 2 years lacked the competence to run a specialized clinic. The media war had been especially cruel. Reporters paid by unknown interests had published articles suggesting that the Hope Clinic was just a millionaire's expensive whim, and that Sarah was an opportunist taking advantage of her employer's wealth. The comments on social media were even worse, filled with classism and misogyny that had made Sarah cry more than once. "Why do they hate us so much?" she had asked Alexander one night, after reading a particularly venomous article that described their relationship as the maid who seduced the master to escape poverty. "Because we're showing them that things can be done differently," he had replied, holding her in the bed they now shared in the Morgan family's historic home. Because a smart, brave woman threatens a system built by arrogant men who believe that titles and money are more important than compassion and competence. The most difficult moment had come when Sarah's father, a proud man who worked as a corn farmer in rural Texas, had traveled to Austin after reading some of the negative news about his daughter. Mr. Robert Miller was a man of few words and many principles, who had raised his daughters to be independent and dignified, but who also carried the prejudices of his generation about social class differences. "Honey," he had said during a tense dinner at a downtown Austin restaurant, "I don't want you to think I'm a fool. I know this young man loves you and you love him, but I also know that rich people like him don't marry people like us. He'll use you as long as it's convenient, and then he'll find a woman from his own social class." The words had hurt more than any newspaper article because they came from someone who loved her and wanted to protect her. Sarah had cried that night, not just because of her father's distrust of Alexander, but because she realized that a part of her shared those fears. Alexander had insisted on meeting Mr. Miller personally and had traveled to West Texas without telling Sarah. He had spent 3 days working in the cornfields alongside his girlfriend's father, sleeping on the same simple cot Sarah had used during her childhood, eating the simple but delicious food prepared by Aunt Rose, and talking for long hours about life, love, and a man's responsibilities to the woman he chooses as his partner. "Mr. Miller," Alexander had said on the last night, as they shared a beer on the porch of the adobe house, "I'm not going to lie to you. I'm rich, and that comes with advantages but also responsibilities. But what I have with Sarah has nothing to do with money. She saved my life, but more importantly, she taught me how to live it. Without her, I'm nothing more than a sad man with a large bank account." Mr. Miller had watched him for a long moment, thoughtfully chewing on a toothpick. "And what happens if you lose all that money one day? What if the clinic fails and you end up poor? Are you still going to love my daughter when you can't give her all the nice things you give her now?" "Mr. Miller, with all due respect, I don't think you really know your daughter," Alexander had replied with a smile. "Sarah isn't with me for the nice things. She's with me despite the nice things. If we lost everything tomorrow, she'd be the first one to start working to get us back on our feet together, and I would follow her anywhere, even if I had to learn to work with my hands again." The answer had been the right one. Mr. Miller had nodded slowly, extended his calloused hand to shake Alexander's, and said simply, "Take care of her. She's the only truly valuable thing I have in this world." When Alexander returned to Austin, tanned from the country sun and with his hands rough from farm work, Sarah knew that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. There were no longer any doubts about either of their intentions, nor about their ability to face any obstacle the future threw at them together. The grand opening of the Hope Clinic was scheduled for a Saturday in March, under the oak trees that Alexander had arranged to have planted around the main building. The guest list included doctors, potential patients, local officials, and the workers who had built the clinic over the past few months. But the most important people for both of them would also be there. Mr. Miller and Aunt Rose had traveled from West Texas. Dr. Vance had invited several of her former colleagues, and even some of the patients Sarah had been treating discreetly had asked for permission to attend. On the eve of the opening, Sarah and Alexander walked alone through the finished facilities. The hallways smelled of fresh paint and disinfectant, but there were also vases of flowers from the garden in every window, and the walls were decorated with photographs of Texas nature that created an atmosphere of tranquility and hope. The main consultation room had large windows overlooking the garden, where the medicinal plants carefully selected by Dr. Vance had already begun to grow. "Do you think Hope would be proud?" Sarah asked, stopping in front of the small memorial they had installed in the garden, a bronze plaque with her sister's name and the phrase, "For those who fight for the lives of others." "I think she'd be proud of the woman you've become," Alexander replied, hugging her from behind. "But more than that, I think she'd be at peace, knowing her death wasn't in vain, that it helped you find your true purpose." That night, as they prepared for bed in their shared room, Alexander surprised Sarah with a small blue velvet box. "It's not what you think," he said quickly, seeing the surprised look on her face. "Well, it is what you think, but it's not when you think." Sarah opened the box with trembling hands and found a simple but beautiful ring, an emerald surrounded by small diamonds, set in white gold. "It's from the same mine where my great-grandfather found the emeralds for my great-grandmother's engagement ring," Alexander explained, kneeling beside the bed. "I wanted to give it to you tonight, before the opening, because I want you to know that my love for you doesn't depend on the success or failure of the clinic. I want you to be my wife, because I can't imagine my life without you, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer. in sickness and in health. Sarah knelt in front of him, taking his face in her hands. "Alexander Morgan, are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm begging you to marry me," he corrected with a nervous smile, "because you're the only woman who could make this proud man kneel and admit that without you he's nothing." "Yes," she whispered before he could finish speaking. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." The kiss that followed was different from all the others. It wasn't the desperate kiss of two people clinging to each other in a medical crisis, nor the tender kiss of two lovers exploring their feelings. It was the kiss of two life partners promising a future together, full of challenges, but also unconditional love. The morning of the opening dawned clear and bright, as if the sky itself had decided to celebrate with them. Sarah woke up early, nervous but excited, and found Alexander already dressed and making coffee in the kitchen. "Ready to change the world, Dr. Miller?" he asked, using the same phrase he had used months ago at the hospital. "Ready to change our world, future Mr. Miller," she replied, showing him the ring sparkling on her finger. But as they headed to the clinic for the final preparations, neither of them could imagine that this day would not only mark the beginning of their new professional life together, but would also bring a surprise that would test their love in a completely unexpected way. Have you had to fight against the prejudices of others to pursue your dreams? Do you think true love can overcome differences in social class? Tell us your experience in the comments, and don't forget to mention which city you're following us from. Give it a like if you believe everyone deserves the chance to build their own dreams. We're thrilled to know our story is reaching hearts everywhere. Chapter 4. The grand opening of the Hope Clinic began like a dream come true. By 10 in the morning, the main garden had filled with guests admiring not only the state-of-the-art medical facilities, but also the carefully thought-out details that made the place an oasis of healing. The blooming oak trees created a green canopy over the white tables, where hibiscus, iced tea and horchata were served, while a string quartet hired especially for the occasion played soft melodies that suited the solemnity of the event. Sarah, radiant in an emerald green dress that matched her engagement ring, walked among the guests with a confidence that had taken months to build. She was no longer the timid housekeeper hiding in the shadows. She was Dr. Sarah Miller, co-founder of an institution that promised to revolutionize healthcare in Austin. Alexander, elegant in a beige linen suit that highlighted his tan from afternoons working in the clinic's garden, never left her side, proudly introducing her as "my fiancé," the clinic's medical director. Mr. Miller, visibly uncomfortable in his only good suit, but beaming with paternal pride, chatted animatedly with Dr. Vance about the medicinal plants in the garden. Aunt Rose had found refuge in the kitchen, where she insisted on helping the caterers with the traditional snacks she had prepared, especially for the occasion. "I never thought I'd see my Sarah become such an important doctor," Mr. Miller commented to one of the invited physicians, unable to hide the emotion in his voice. Ever since she was a little girl, she said she was going to heal people, but after what happened with her little sister, well, I thought she had lost that part of herself forever. The most emotional moment of the morning came when Sarah cut the inaugural ribbon, accompanied by Alexander and Dr. Vance. The local media's cameras captured the moment the three founders crossed the clinic's threshold together, followed by a procession of guests eager to see the facilities. The guided tour was a resounding success. The medical specialists were impressed by the cutting-edge equipment, while representatives from community organizations praised the free care programs they had designed for low-income families. The pediatric area, decorated with colorful murals depicting American folktales, drew sighs of admiration from the mothers present. But it was in the rheumatology wing where Sarah truly shone. With the passion of someone who had found her true calling, she explained how every design detail was intended for the well-being of patients with autoimmune diseases, the natural lighting that reduced fatigue, the antimicrobial surfaces that prevented infections, and the relaxation spaces where patients could meditate or simply rest between treatments. "This isn't just a clinic," she explained to a group of journalists. "It's a place where we believe healing goes beyond medication. Here we treat whole people, not just symptoms." However, as the crowd began to disperse and the formal guests departed, the moment Sarah had been waiting for with a mix of nervousness and excitement arrived, the arrival of her first real patients. Maria Johnson, a 45-year-old woman who worked as a seamstress in a local market, had been one of the cases Sarah had been discreetly following for the past few months. Misdiagnosed with common arthritis at a public hospital, she had spent 2 years suffering from intense, progressively worsening pain. When Sarah first examined her at a free clinic organized in her neighborhood, she immediately suspected systemic lupus erythematosus. "Dr. Miller," Maria said, shyly entering the main consultation room accompanied by her teenage daughter. "I can't believe a place this beautiful is for people like me." "Maria," Sarah replied with a warm smile, "this place is especially for people like you, for people who have been ignored by a system that considers them invisible." The consultation lasted over an hour. Sarah carefully reviewed all the previous studies, ordered new tests in the clinic's lab, and most importantly, listened attentively to Maria's full story, how the pain had started, how it affected her work, how it had changed her family life, what treatments she had tried and which ones had failed. For the first time in 2 years, Maria confessed to her daughter as they left the consultation, "I feel like someone really listened to me. They didn't just see me as a list of symptoms, but as a person." But while Sarah was internally celebrating this first success, Alexander was facing his own crisis in the clinic's administrative office. Charles Morgan, his first cousin and the sole heir of another branch of the family, had arrived unannounced, accompanied by a lawyer and an expression Alexander knew all too well, the same one he wore as a child when he was about to cause trouble. "Dear cousin," Charles began with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "what a surprise to find you playing the philanthropic doctor. Though I suppose when one falls in love with the housekeeper, one can do some very expensive, crazy things." Alexander felt the blood rush to his face, but he controlled himself. Charles had always had a knack for finding the exact words that hurt the most, and he had perfected that skill over the 35 years they had known each other. "What do you want, Charles?" he asked directly, not bothering to respond to the provocation. "I've come to save you from yourself," Charles replied, opening a leather briefcase. "Do you have any idea how much money you've spent on this whim? According to my calculations, nearly $2 million. Money that, by the way, partially belongs to the family estate we share." The lawyer accompanying Charles cleared his throat. "Mr. Morgan, we have come to file a formal lawsuit questioning the financial transactions you have made without consulting the family board, specifically the sale of 3 commercial properties and the liquidation of investment bonds that affect the interests of other heirs." Alexander felt as if the floor had opened up beneath him. Technically, Charles was right. Although he controlled the majority of the family businesses, there were some assets that legally required family board approval to be sold or transferred. In his haste to fund the clinic, he had overlooked some of these legal requirements. "But there is a solution," Charles continued with false magnanimity. "We are willing to withdraw the lawsuit if you accept our conditions." "What conditions?" "First, you immediately dissolve this partnership with the Dr. Miller, is it? Second, you sell the clinic to a group of serious investors I have already identified. Third, you go back to focusing on the family's real businesses. And fourth," Charles paused dramatically, "you end this ridiculous relationship with the maid and marry someone of your own social class. Paige Harrison, the daughter of the owner of the largest hospital chain in the country, would be delighted to resume her relationship with you." The mention of Paige was like a punch to the gut. Paige Harrison had been his girlfriend for 3 years, a relationship practically arranged by their families that had ended when she gave him an ultimatum: marry her immediately or break up for good. Alexander had chosen freedom, but he knew she had never truly accepted the breakup. "Charles," Alexander said in a dangerously calm voice, "you can take your lawsuit and shove it. This clinic is not for sale. Sarah is the woman I'm going to marry, and if that means losing part of the family money, so be it." "Are you sure?" Charles asked, rising slowly. "Because once we file this lawsuit, it's going to become a public scandal. The media will investigate every dollar you've spent. They'll question your girlfriend's credentials. They'll bring the whole hospital story to light. Do you really want to expose your dear Sarah to that level of scrutiny?" The threat was clear and effective. Alexander knew that Charles had media contacts and would not hesitate to use personal information to destroy both the clinic's and Sarah's reputations. "You have 24 hours to decide," Charles added, heading for the door. "After that, this is going to get very ugly for everyone involved." When Sarah finished her afternoon consultations and went to find Alexander to celebrate the success of their first day, she found him sitting in his office with his head in his hands, an expression she hadn't seen since his darkest days in the hospital. "What happened?" she asked immediately, approaching him with concern reflected in every line of her face. Alexander told her everything: Charles's visit, the legal threats, the ultimatum. As he spoke, he watched the day's joy slowly fade from Sarah's face, replaced by an expression of steely determination he knew well. "And what are you going to do?" she asked when he finished. "I'm going to fight," he replied without hesitation. "I'm going to hire the best lawyers. I'm going to publicly expose what Charles is trying to do. I'm going to—" "No," Sarah interrupted him gently. "You're not going to do any of that." Alexander looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" I mean, I'm going to resign from the clinic, she said, her voice trying to sound firm but trembling slightly. I'm going to sell my share of the partnership. I'm going back to West Texas with my dad, and I'm going to leave you free to solve your family problems without me being an obstacle. Sarah, no, Alexander exclaimed, standing up so abruptly his chair rolled backward. I'm not going to let you give up on your dream because of my idiot cousin and his threats. It's not because of the threats, she lied, avoiding his gaze. It's because I've realized your family was right all along. We're from two different worlds. I don't belong in your life, Alexander. It was nice while it lasted, but now it's time to be realistic. The words came out of her mouth like poison, and she knew she was lying with every syllable. But she also knew that if Alexander fought his family for her, he would lose everything: his fortune, his companies, his social standing, everything he had built for years. And even though he said he didn't care, she knew he would eventually resent her for being the cause of his ruin. Sarah, look at me, he pleaded, taking her face in his hands. Look me in the eye and tell me you don't love me. Tell me this has all been a lie, and I swear I'll let you go right now. She looked directly into his eyes, those blue eyes she had learned to love more than her own life, and opened her mouth to tell the lie that would separate them forever. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she burst into tears with a desperation that came from the depths of her soul. I love you, she whispered between sobs. I love you so much it hurts to breathe when I think about losing you. But precisely because I love you, I can't be the reason you lose everything you've worked to build. Alexander hugged her so tightly, he almost cut off her breath. Sarah Miller, listen to me carefully. Without you, nothing I've built makes sense. The companies are just numbers in a bank account. The money is just paper. But you are the reason I get up every morning wanting to be a better man. They remained embraced in the silence of the office as the sun set over Austin, painting the sky orange and pink. In the clinic's garden, the oak trees continued to flourish, indifferent to the human drama unfolding just a few feet away. That night, neither of them slept. Sarah stayed awake, packing bags she didn't want to pack, while Alexander remained in his study reviewing legal documents and making calls to lawyers who didn't answer at that hour. But what neither of them knew was that Dr. Vance had been listening to part of their conversation from the hallway, and she had already begun to move her own pieces in a chess game that Charles Morgan didn't even know was being played. Because the wise doctor had information about the Morgan family that neither Alexander nor Charles knew, information she had kept for decades, waiting for the right moment to use it, and that moment had just arrived. The next morning she arrived with a mysterious smile and a folder full of documents that would forever change the course of this love story that seemed destined for failure. Sarah, Alexander, she said with the authority of someone who has lived long enough to know that the most important battles are won with intelligence, not with force. Before you make any rash decisions, I think there are some things about the past you need to know. Sit down, because what I'm about to tell you is going to change everything you thought you knew about yourselves and the reasons your paths crossed. Chapter 5. Tuesday morning dawned grey and rainy, as if the Austin sky wanted to reflect the mood reigning at the Hope Clinic. Sarah had spent the night packing her few belongings, while Alexander had stayed awake in his study, alternating between phone calls with lawyers and long sips of bourbon that failed to numb the pain in his chest. Dr. Vance had summoned them both to the clinic's library at 9 in the morning, with a solemnity neither of them had seen in her before. When they arrived, they found her sitting behind the mahogany desk, a thick manila folder in front of her, and an expression that mixed determination with deep sadness. Sit down, she said without preamble, pointing to the two chairs she had placed in front of the desk. What I'm about to tell you will change your perspective on this whole situation, but it's also going to hurt. A lot. Sarah and Alexander exchanged worried glances before taking their seats. The tension in the air was palpable, like the electricity before a storm. Alexander, Dr. Vance began, opening the folder, what do you really know about the car accident in which your parents died 5 years ago? The question took them by surprise. Alexander frowned, clearly confused about what that could have to do with their current situation. I know what they told me, he answered slowly, that Dad lost control of the car on the highway to Galveston, that they went off the road and fell down an embankment. They died instantly, and you never questioned why a driver as experienced as your father, who had made that trip hundreds of times, would lose control on a clear night with no traffic? Accidents happen, Doctor, Alexander said, though his voice was beginning to sound less certain. There aren't always logical explanations for tragedies. Dr. Vance took a file from the folder and placed it on the desk. Alexander, your father didn't lose control of the vehicle. He had a massive heart attack at the wheel. A heart attack caused by an autoimmune disease that had been progressing for years without a proper diagnosis. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander had turned pale, while Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "How do you know that?" Alexander asked in a thin voice. "Because I was the rheumatologist who was trying to diagnose him," Dr. Vance replied, each word seeming to cost her enormous effort. "Your father, Edward Morgan, had been coming to see me discreetly for 6 months before his death. He had symptoms that suggested systemic lupus erythematosus, but we were in the early stages of diagnosis." Alexander shot up from his chair. "Why did you never tell me this? Why did you keep this a secret for 5 years?" "Because he asked me not to tell anyone in the family until we had a definitive diagnosis," the doctor replied, tears in her eyes. Edward was a proud man, and he was terrified of his family seeing him as weak or sick. He wanted to be sure before worrying everyone. Sarah, who had remained silent processing the information, suddenly understood the magnitude of what she was hearing. "Doctor," she said in a trembling voice, "are you saying that lupus is hereditary in the Morgan family?" "Not exactly hereditary," Dr. Vance clarified, "but there is a genetic predisposition. And Alexander, the episode you had at the hospital was not your first symptom. You've been having signs for years, but you've ignored them or attributed them to stress." Alexander sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. "Why are you telling me this now? What does this have to do with Charles's situation?" "It has everything to do with it," the doctor replied, taking another file from the folder, "because Charles Morgan knows about it too." The revelation fell like a bomb. Sarah felt the blood freeze in her veins. "What?" Alexander whispered. "Charles was present at one of your father's consultations," Dr. Vance explained. "Edward had a crisis and Charles had taken him to the hospital. I was on call that night. Charles overheard when I explained to your father about the possible genetic condition and the implications for his children." The puzzle was beginning to come together in Alexander's mind, and he didn't like the picture it was forming. "Charles knows I have a predisposition to lupus," he said slowly, "and he knows that could affect my ability to have healthy children." "Exactly," the doctor confirmed. "And he also knows that if that information becomes public, he could use arguments of medical incapacity to question your competence to manage the family businesses." Sarah stood up, trembling with rage. "That bastard is using Alexander's illness as blackmail. He doesn't just want to destroy the clinic, he wants to destroy him completely." "But there's more," Dr. Vance continued, her tone growing even grimmer. "Sarah, do you remember the night your sister Hope died?" The question was like a dagger straight to the heart. Sarah swayed slightly, and Alexander immediately stood up to support her. "Why are you bringing that up?" Sarah asked, pain evident in her voice. "Because I was at the hospital that night," Dr. Vance replied. "It was my day off, but they had called in all available specialists for a massive emergency. There had been a multi-car pile-up on the highway, and they needed all the help they could get." Sarah looked at her, confused. "But you never mentioned." "Because I didn't want to revive the pain unnecessarily," the doctor interrupted. "But now you need to know the whole truth. Sarah, your sister didn't die from medical negligence." "What do you mean?" Sarah whispered, clinging to Alexander's arm. "Hope had a rare undiagnosed medical condition, a congenital malformation in her intestine that made her extremely vulnerable to surgical complications. Even if they had listened to your suspicions that night, even if they had made the correct diagnosis from the start, the chances of saving her were minimal." Sarah collapsed into her chair, sobbing. "But I insisted. I knew something was wrong." "And you were right," Dr. Vance confirmed gently. "Your medical instincts were correct." "But Sarah, my dear girl, some battles can't be won no matter how well we fight." Alexander knelt beside Sarah's chair, taking her hands in his. "Sarah, all this time you've been carrying a guilt that wasn't yours. But that's not the most important thing right now," Dr. Vance continued, her voice regaining its firmness. "The important thing is that Charles Morgan also knows about Hope's death." They both looked at her in horror. "How?" Alexander asked. "Because he was at the hospital that night. His father, your dad's brother, had been in the multi-car accident. Charles was present when the doctors were discussing all the cases from that night, including Hope's. He heard when they mentioned that a medical student had tried to warn about complications they hadn't taken seriously. The final realization hit Sarah like a hammer. Charles knows who I am. He's known who I am from the beginning." "Exactly," the doctor confirmed. "Charles not only knows about your medical past, but he also knows about the connection between your sister's illness and Alexander's condition. Both are manifestations of rare genetic conditions that affect the immune system." Alexander stood up slowly, and Sarah could see the full understanding of the situation reflected on his face. Charles orchestrated all of this, he said, his voice trembling with contained rage. He knew I was going to get sick. He knew who Sarah was, and he probably arranged for her to end up working at my house. It's very likely, Dr. Vance nodded. Charles is many things, but he isn't stupid. He's been playing a very long game, waiting for the perfect moment to take control of the family businesses. Sarah wiped her tears and stood up with a steely determination that Alexander recognized immediately. It was the same expression she'd had when she saved him in the hospital. "Do you have proof of all this?" she asked. Dr. Vance smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun. "I have all the medical records, all the recorded consultations, and I also have this." She took a small digital recording device from the folder. "What is that?" Alexander asked. "A conversation Charles had on the phone yesterday with someone he hired to investigate Sarah's background. A conversation in which he admits to knowing both her medical history and the Morgan family's genetic condition. A conversation in which he also reveals his true intentions to take control of the companies, using Alexander's illness as a pretext." The silence that followed was different from the last. This time it was not filled with desperation, but with a cold, calculated determination. "Doctor," Sarah finally said, "how did you get that recording?" The old woman smiled with an almost mischievous expression. "Let's just say I'm not the only person Charles has underestimated over the years. I have contacts in many places, and some of them don't appreciate the methods he uses to do business." Alexander began to pace the room, clearly processing all the information and formulating a plan. "So we have evidence that Charles has been manipulating the situation from the beginning," he said, more to himself than to the others. "We have proof that he knows confidential medical information he shouldn't have, and we have evidence that he's using that information for blackmail and extortion." "Exactly," Dr. Vance confirmed. "But more importantly, now you two know the whole truth about your past and can make decisions based on real facts, not on unfounded guilt and fears." Sarah went to Alexander and took his face in her hands, looking him directly in the eyes. "Alexander," she said, her voice firm and clear, "I want you to know that nothing we just heard changes how I feel about you. If you have lupus, we'll face it together. If Charles wants a fight, we'll fight together. And if there are genetic risks for our future children, we'll make informed decisions together." He closed his eyes and rested his forehead against hers. "Sarah, are you sure? Because once we start this battle, there's no going back. Charles is going to fight dirty. He's going to try to destroy us publicly. He's going to—" "Alexander Morgan," she interrupted him with a fierce smile, "have you already forgotten that I fell in love with you when I thought you were just a rich, boring businessman? Do you really think I'm going to get scared now that I know you're a warrior who's been fighting his own genetics without even knowing it?" The kiss they shared was different from all the others. It was not desperate or tender, but solid and determined, like a seal on a contract they were both signing with their hearts. "So," Dr. Vance said, closing the folder with a definitive gesture, "are you ready to fight back?" The following days became a silent but fierce war. While Charles believed he had Alexander cornered, unaware that his blackmail had been discovered, Sarah and Alexander worked with a team of lawyers specializing in corporate fraud to build a case that would not only defend the clinic, but also expose Charles's illegal maneuvers. Dr. Vance proved to be an invaluable ally, not only for the evidence she had gathered, but for her network of contacts in the medical and legal worlds of Austin. Through her, they discovered that Charles had been involved in several similar schemes for years, using privileged information to manipulate family and business decisions. But the moment of truth came 3 days later, when Charles showed up at the clinic with a triumphant smile and a team of lawyers, expecting to find a defeated Alexander ready to accept his terms. Instead, he was met by Sarah, Alexander, Dr. Vance, and a group of lawyers who had enough evidence to not only block his lawsuit, but to file criminal charges for extortion, fraud, and illegal use of confidential medical information. "Charles," Alexander said with an icy calm, "I think it's time we had a very honest conversation about the future of this family." The look of confidence slowly faded from Charles's face as he realized he had gravely underestimated his cousin and, more importantly, the woman standing beside him with a smile that promised this battle was just beginning. Chapter 6. The final confrontation with Charles Morgan took place in the conference room of the most prestigious law firm in Austin, an elegant space with large windows overlooking the city's historic downtown. It was noon on a sunny Thursday, but the atmosphere inside the room was as tense as the calm before a hurricane. Charles had arrived accompanied by 3 lawyers and an attitude that mixed arrogance with a growing concern. Over the past few days, he had begun to suspect that something was not going according to his original plan, especially after several of his media contacts had informed him that the story had suddenly lost interest. Alexander, Sarah, and Dr. Vance sat on the opposite side of the table, accompanied by Raul Hernandez, a corporate law specialist known for being both brilliant and ruthless. Spread out between them was an impressive collection of documents, recordings, and evidence they had gathered over the past week. "Well, cousin," Charles began with a forced smile, "I hope you've come to be reasonable. My terms remain the same. You dissolve the partnership with your girlfriend, sell the clinic, and get back to focusing on the family's serious business." "Before we talk about terms," Mr. Hernandez interrupted, "I think there are a few things you need to hear, Mr. Charles Morgan." Without further ado, he activated the digital player, and Charles's voice filled the room. It was the recording of his phone conversation, where he admitted to knowing confidential medical information about the family, revealed his manipulation strategy, and even mocked the little housekeeper who thinks she's a doctor. With every word that came from the player, Charles's face grew paler. When the recording ended, the silence was deafening. "That recording is illegal," one of Charles's lawyers stammered. "It can't be used as evidence." "On the contrary," Mr. Hernandez replied calmly, "the recording was made by one of the parties in the conversation, which makes it perfectly legal. But we also have this." He proceeded to display a series of documents detailing the suspicious financial transactions Charles had carried out over the past few years, using privileged information he had obtained illegally. "We also have testimonies from 3 former employees of your companies who are willing to testify about your unethical methods," the lawyer continued, "and documentary evidence that you have been illegally accessing confidential medical records for years." Charles had stood up, clearly agitated. "This is a conspiracy. You're trying to destroy me because you can't accept that I'm right about this ridiculous relationship." "Charles," Alexander said, his voice a mix of sadness and determination, "for years I considered you almost a brother. Yes, you were competitive and sometimes envious, but I never thought you were capable of this." "Capable of what?" Charles shouted. "Of trying to save my family from an opportunist who took advantage of your illness to get into our lives." Sarah, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but carried an authority that made everyone in the room pay attention. "Charles," she said, looking him directly in the eyes, "you knew who I was from the first day I came to work at Alexander's house. You knew about my sister, you knew about my medical history, and you knew about the Morgan family's genetic condition. I'm not an opportunist who took advantage of the circumstances. I'm a doctor who was manipulated by you to be in the right place at the right time to save the life of the man I love." The direct accusation took Charles by surprise. That's ridiculous. I had nothing to do with... We have the records from the domestic employment agency that contacted you when Alexander needed a housekeeper," Dr. Vance interrupted. "We have evidence that you specifically recommended Sarah, presenting her as an ideal candidate because of her previous experience in hospitals. We also have the testimony of the agency's director," Mr. Hernandez added, "who is willing to state that you paid her an extra commission to ensure Miss Miller was hired." Charles slumped into his chair, finally understanding the magnitude of the evidence they had against him. His lawyers exchanged worried glances and began to murmur among themselves. "So," Alexander continued, "now that it's clear who the real manipulator is in this situation, let's talk about the new terms." Over the next hour, a settlement was negotiated that would forever change the dynamics of the Morgan family. Charles would renounce any stake in the main family businesses, withdraw all his lawsuits, and sign a non-disclosure agreement prohibiting him from revealing medical information about any family member. In return, Alexander would not press criminal charges and would allow him to keep some minor properties to manage independently. "But there's one more condition," Sarah added when it seemed the negotiations were over. "I want you to know, Charles, that your plan partially worked. I did fall in love with Alexander. I did become the woman he needed to save him. But what you didn't calculate is that he also became the man I needed to save myself." When the signatures were on all the documents and Charles left with his lawyers, visibly defeated, a different kind of silence filled the room. This time it wasn't tension or fear, but the calm that comes after a storm has finally passed. "How do you feel?" Alexander asked Sarah as they walked to the building's parking garage. "Free," she replied without hesitation. "For the first time in years, I feel completely free." The following months were a time of rebuilding and growth. The Hope Clinic not only survived the controversy, but became a model of medical excellence that attracted attention from institutions across the country. Sarah officially completed her specialization in rheumatology under Dr. Vance's supervision, and her reputation as an exceptional diagnostician spread rapidly through the medical community. Alexander, after undergoing thorough examinations that confirmed an early diagnosis of lupus, became a living example of how the disease could be successfully managed with proper treatment and emotional support. His story inspired many other patients who came to the clinic feeling defeated by their diagnoses. The wedding took place a year later in the gardens of the Hope Clinic, surrounded by the oak trees that had now grown large enough to create a true natural cathedral. Mr. Miller walked Sarah down the aisle of green grass, tears of pride in his eyes, while Dr. Vance officiated the ceremony as an honorary justice of the peace. "Sarah Miller," Alexander said during his vows, his voice breaking with emotion, "you taught me that scars don't define us, but how we choose to heal does. You taught me that true love doesn't avoid difficulties, but faces them together with the one you love. I promise to be your partner in sickness and in health, in success and in failure, on easy days and on difficult nights." "Alexander Morgan," Sarah replied, "you taught me that I deserve to be seen, to be heard, to be loved for who I really am. You gave me the strength to forgive myself and the courage to build something beautiful from the ruins of my pain. I promise to be your partner in every sense, your accomplice in our dreams, and your refuge when the world becomes too heavy." The kiss that sealed their marriage was witnessed not only by their loved ones, but also by Maria Johnson and dozens of other patients who had found hope and healing in the clinic that was born from the love between a wounded doctor and a sick businessman. 5 years later, the Hope Clinic had grown into a medical complex that included a research center, a specialized nursing school, and a scholarship program for low-income medical students. Sarah had been recognized as one of the most innovative rheumatologists in the United States, while Alexander had completely restructured his companies to focus on socially responsible investments. Their first child, Edward Hope Morgan Miller, was born on a sunny spring day after a carefully monitored pregnancy that showed he had not inherited any significant genetic predisposition. Sarah held him in her arms for the first time in the same clinic room where she had treated her first patient, and she knew she had finally found the peace she had been searching for so many years. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked, sitting next to her in the rocking chair they had placed by the window overlooking the garden. "I'm thinking about hope," Sarah replied, gently stroking her son's head. "I'm thinking that all the pain I felt for losing her finally makes sense. Without that loss, I never would have left medicine. Without leaving medicine, I never would have come to your house. Without coming to your house, I never would have met you. And without meeting you, I never would have found a way to honor her memory by building something beautiful." Alexander kissed her forehead gently. "Do you think she'd be proud?" "I think she'd be at peace," Sarah replied, knowing that her big sister finally learned that she deserves to be happy. As the sun set over Austin, painting the sky pink and gold, the small family rested in the clinic that had been born from tragedy but had flourished with love. In the garden, the oak trees continued to bloom, and on a small but visible plaque, the words, "Hope Clinic, where no patient is invisible," shone in the last rays of the day. The story of Sarah and Alexander had become a local legend, told over and over to young couples who visited the clinic's gardens, as proof that true love can not only survive adversity, but can transform it into something beautiful and lasting. And every time a new patient arrived at the clinic feeling invisible, defeated by a difficult diagnosis, or abandoned by a medical system that wouldn't listen, they found within the walls of the Hope Clinic the silent but powerful story of a woman who had learned to be seen and a man who had learned to see beyond appearances. Because in the end, as Sarah always told her medical students, true healing doesn't just happen in hospitals or with medicine. It happens when someone who has been invisible finally finds someone who sees them, really sees them, for who they are in the deepest part of their soul. And here ends our love story of Sarah and Alexander, a story that reminds us that we all deserve to be seen, heard, and loved for who we truly are. What did you think of this ending? Did you identify with any part of the story? We would love to know what you think of this love story that was born from pain but blossomed with hope. Write to us in the comments from which city you are following us, what moved you the most, and if you have a similar experience you would like to share with our community. Don't forget to like this story if you believe that true love can overcome any obstacle. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that go straight to the heart, and share with us what kind of story you would like to hear next. Because as we learned with Sarah and Alexander, the best stories are those where wounded people find a way to heal together, building something beautiful on the ruins of their pain. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey, and we'll see you in the next story.